good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Bulugeta. I'm a lecturer of African politics at SOAS. I've worked with Julia for 3 years, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Julia. So, Professor Julia Gallagher she's a professor of African politics at SOAS and a reader in international development at King's College, London. Her research is about how citizens think about and help make states, combining political, social, aesthetic, psychoanalytic theory with extensive fieldwork. She has written on UK-Africa relations, images of Africa, and Zimbabwean conceptions of the state in relation to the wider world. She currently leads an ERC-funded project about architecture and the states in sub-Saharan Africa, and finishing a book on state building in South Africa, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia. We are recording the event, but only the speaker will be recorded. Over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Daniel. What he meant was that you won't appear on the screen. You won't be filmed, your faces. Yeah, okay. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much for coming. I feel quite nervous. I realise the thing that makes me most nervous is the fact that family and friends are here. I'm not used to sort of giving an academic talk. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. The other thing is that I never had an inaugural lecture. So we decided that we would make this into a bit of a party, and we're going to have drinks at the end. So downstairs in the gallery, everybody is very, very welcome to come down and have a drink. But you have to get through the lecture first. Right. So this is my team. This is us when we started, when we were fresh-faced and young. You can see that Daniel still had hair in those days, and my hair was obviously not white, so it was quite some time ago. But this is my team who worked with me on this the African State Architecture project. And it's IB, Joe, Daniel, and Kukwa. There's somebody missing from that picture, who is Sunil, who has been our coordinator and manager of the project, and has been an absolutely, came a little bit later to the project, but has been an integral part of it. And I wanted to say something about them. So we've been working together over the last 5 years on a project that tries to understand African politics by looking at architecture. And I want to just say before I start, to thank them all for being really fantastic colleagues, and for all their intellectual and emotional support throughout the time that we worked together. And the last 5 years have thrown up all sorts of difficulties for most of us in various ways, but they've also been the absolute highlight of my working life, and that is down to this team. Hi. I also want to thank my colleagues and students at SOAS for being a fantastic home for the project, and in many ways supported us and offering enormous intellectual stimulation as well, and support for the project. Okay, so to business. The puzzle of my research has been about the state in Africa. What holds states together? What makes states compelling? In most African countries, the modern state is an outcome of colonialism, and it's understandably, therefore, a problematic institution. Weak or spidery, as Mahmoud Mamdani says, culturally dissonant sometimes and lacking in popular authority, as Peter Eke describes very brilliantly in his work. A lot of the literature suggests how African states are held together by elites who have particular interests in seeing the state work, or by the international system, which has an interest in seeing states continue and holds them together from the outside. But it's often assumed that there's very little popular, domestic attachment to it. But I've never really found that convincing. I think that citizens in African states or African countries are invested in the state. And this project really is about trying to find out how they're invested and how much they're invested. And does their investment look different in different parts of the continent? Hi. My SOAS colleagues. Hello. I've just thanked you. You're too late. So The research has been principally about how citizens read and contribute to making the state. So I'm going to, I flashed through a couple of buildings already without explaining them, so I'll try and explain them as I go a bit more. And I'll come to this building in a minute. It's a really very important building for my project. And I want to, first of all, tell you a little bit about the premise of the project, which is why can we understand, or how can we understand the state through buildings? Now, state buildings are an eclectic bunch. So they include things like parliaments, presidential palaces, ministries, courts, and then sort of more mundane schools, like mundane buildings like schools or police stations or hospitals. And even sometimes people include sports stadiums and churches as state buildings. They are symbols of state meaning, and they are also the locus of state activity. So they manifest the state materially as sites where policy is framed, where laws are made and where they're enforced, from where tax is gathered and services are provided. But they also articulate an emotional meaning about the state as symbols of the collective, of the nation. So buildings are a bit like, gosh, hello, hi, there's some spaces down the front. There's, Amelia, there's, yeah, okay. I think quite a good way of thinking about this is a state is a bit like state buildings are a bit like public archives of the state, because you see them, they are part of the landscape, and they carry the state's history, and they carry the state's status, its aesthetic, through its aesthetic, their aesthetic and their size and where they sit. And the reason I've started with this building is because it's the South African home of the presidency. Hello. And it sits on top of a hill and it overlooks the capital, Pretoria. It's extremely grand. It's a colonial building, as you might guess. It was built by Herbert Baker, who was a very famous British colonial architect. And his idea was to model this building, which was meant to represent the union of the Boers and the English after the Second South African War, the Anglo-Boer War. It was meant to symbolise the union of the two white races in South Africa, and he wanted it to look like an Athenian model of the state, and he said it would represent the attributes of the eternal, and he meant the eternal imperial project. So that's the Union buildings, and they sit there overlooking Pretoria. And that's what was intended when they were built, and they worked all the way through the apartheid era as the headquarters of the presidency and other parts of the state as well. Very much the sort of core of the state, and very sort of assertively so. But they're also the site of physical and emotional connections between the state and citizens through the personal encounters that people have, through rumours and fantasies that they have. And again, if you look at the Union buildings, people will talk about how they think about their ancestors. Black people will talk about how they think about their ancestors building this building and what that might have meant, how that might have felt. They talk about demonstrations against the apartheid system during the apartheid era, particularly the Women's March against the pass laws in the 1950s. And they put different kinds of meanings into this building. And since the end of apartheid, some people also associate this building with Nelson Mandela. He was inaugurated here. And of course, with the current presidency and what goes on inside, which have all sorts of interpretations and are subject to all sorts of rumours and fantasies. And finally, the reason why buildings are a good way of doing this, of studying the state, is because they're a physical representation which citizens can grasp and assess the state by, and that makes them, for researchers, a good tool. It's like a canvas on which the state can be explored and understood. So let me talk a little bit about how I did the research. We looked at, or I looked, so I should just say that the five of us looked at different aspects of this, and we worked alongside each other as colleagues rather than all on the same piece of research. So the way that I did my bit of the research was I was looking at state buildings in 5 countries, which are Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana up in West Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa, Ethiopia in the east, and then South Africa right down the bottom. And the reason I chose these 5 countries was partly because I wanted to go there, of course, as every researcher does, but also because they're very different in size, they're very different in geographical location, as you can see. They have different kinds of economies, they have different kinds of political systems. They are different from each other, they have different colonial histories. And what I wanted to do was to explore different forms of state. There's so much literature about the state in Africa as though it's something which is similar everywhere, and I wanted to see how it was different everywhere, or whether it was different everywhere. The core of my research involved having discussions with groups of citizens, so focus group discussions in each of the 5 countries. And I worked with local research assistants, and we assembled, or we didn't actually assemble, we approached existing groups of citizens. And the idea was to try and get a range of citizens to make sure that we had people from different kinds of backgrounds, people, so we made sure we had men and women, we made sure we had different age groups, different socioeconomic groups. But we did it really through existing groups. So we might, for example, have found a church where we approached the pastor and asked whether we could come along after the service and do a focus group with some of the people who were there anyway. And the idea of that was twofold. One was well, it was actually onefold, really. It was to make people comfortable. So it was to make sure that people felt that they were in a group where they were kindreds, sort of that they knew each other, either they knew each other literally or they knew each other because they were part of the same group. And it also meant that we could come to them and we could sit on their space and we could get a sense of it, but also that it was their space and we were visitors. And that made people more comfortable, I think. I think I would describe, sorry, actually I should say what we asked them. We always started the interview with a question of what's the most important state building in your country? And then we would have a discussion about that, and some argument sometimes, and then we would drop a list, a sort of short list of what we thought the most important 5 were. And they varied from group to group, obviously, because people were making the choices. And then I would start asking them to explain or to describe the buildings. So just describe the building, describe the parliament, describe the hospital, whatever had come up. And I think at one point I thought I might show them pictures, and then I realised that if you're looking at a picture, it really narrows what you're saying. Rather than things coming into your head, which might be all sorts of associations, you're very much narrowed by the picture. So we didn't do that. We just asked people to think about what came into their heads. And the interviews nearly always followed a similar pattern, which was at the beginning, people would say, I really don't know anything about architecture. What can I say? I'm not an expert about architecture. And I would say, well, I'm not either. I'm not an architect. What I really want you to do is to tell me about your feelings about the building, what you think about it. It's not really about knowledge. It's about what you associate with the building, what you think of when we talk about it. And then quite quickly, people did have lots of things to say. And very quickly also, they realised that we were talking about the politics of the state. We were talking about what the state was like, what it felt like, what it looked like. So we were then able to sort of think about how the buildings embodied the state and in what ways. So from these discussions, I began to sort of think about what was being said. And I think one of the most important parts of this that I realised was that this was a work of gathering emotional and physical reactions to the state through the buildings. Stories, rumours, fantasies, but also remembering being at a building or how you felt about going past the building or whether you felt that you were allowed to go inside the building or what went on inside the building, either because you knew, because you'd been, or more likely because you had heard rumours or you knew about shady business or whatever it was that people felt. And so as we sort of had these discussions and I began to think about how to sort of pull this together, I thought what I was doing was I was gathering this emotional and physical reactions and turning them into sort of ideas. And we did that in the focus groups, and then I continued that work afterwards. This is a focus group in Kinshasa, in a garage under somebody's apartment. I was really struck by how differently people tended to describe the outsides and the insides of buildings. So they saw the outsides, they talked about seeing them, and even if they hadn't been inside, they talked about smelling, hearing, or feeling the insides. So, for example, if they were describing a building from the outside, they would talk about the colour, the statues, maybe if there were pillars, they would talk about how big it was, and then they would begin to get onto the history of the building and the country and what it represents, what happened in that building. Sometimes they would use metaphors to describe the building. The union buildings that I showed you a minute ago, people describe them in all sorts of ways as like the backbone of the country, where we get our freedom, and so on. Or the devil's headquarters. You know, they weren't all positive, of course. There was a sort of move towards a kind of more intellectual approach as well, sort of thinking about what the building was intended for. So if it was a parliament, you know, for discussion, for representation. Whereas when they started talking about the insides of the building, they were much more likely to talk about a kind of haptic senses, like what the building sounded like, what it felt like, what it smelled like, and much more likely to talk about emotional reactions like feelings of nausea, or maybe feeling safe, or feeling spooked. They talk much more about rumours and fantasies. Now, I found interesting work from architects like Johanny Plasma and also Barbara Irwin that explored how seeing is predicated on a distance from something. So you look at something from a distance. And that engenders a feeling of some sort of control over the object, some sense of, there's a chair just here. Some sort of sense of being able to choose to look or choose not to look. And when you do look, that you see the thing and you can sort of encompass it. You sort of take some sort of hold of it. Whereas the haptic senses are predicated on being right up close or actually inside something, and produce feelings of dependence on the thing that you're inside, the object, the building. So you don't choose to smell a building or hear the sounds. They come into you whether you want them or not. You don't control them. And you experience them also in bits. So you don't have a sort of sense of being able to encompass the whole thing. It's sort of like they're sort of impressionistic and more disjointed. And I began to think about how these two kinds of experience imply two positions in relation to the state. One much more objective and one much more subjective. And I'll talk a little bit about the two of them. So this is the main government offices in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, which are put into these buildings in a rather opaque way. You're not quite sure which ministry is on which floor, and they're all in these 5 towers. You can only see 3 of them, but there are 5. So objectivity is built on separation, on seeing the state apart, a feeling of being able to grasp it as a whole, as I've said, a sense of understanding it in perhaps a more rational way. And James Scott very famously wrote about seeing states, about states that see or try to see. And his account describes how state elites pursue ultra-rational ways of ordering society, or they try to, and attempting to sort of tidy societies up and tidy people up. And he describes how citizens tend to push back, wanting to hold on to variety and even disordered ways of doing things. Now, I don't think his dichotomy is quite right, because I think citizens also have a capacity and desire to see the state and to value aspects of it as rational, even if idealized and tenuous. On the other side, on the other hand, the sort of more subjectivity. This is a picture of inside one of Mobutu's ruined palaces. This is one is just outside Kinshasa. And I'm showing it because, well, it kind of speaks to what I'm going to say, but it's not very easy to take pictures inside state buildings, so I don't have very many, so I've got this one, and I like it. So subjectivity is about, as I've said, about implication, about feeling oneself inside and part of the state, about absorbing it and being absorbed into it. So in fact, if you think about it, so you are actually, once you're inside, you're contributing to it, you're part of it. Feeling it in fragments and often making a more emotional connection. And Joanne Jethro describes the way that smells and sounds can take you back to early personal memories, to your own history and identity. So this kind of sense in which these kinds of sensory engagements actually take you more into yourself. They are about your story much more closely than the kind of the grand big story. And I think also Achille Mbembe's work is useful, and he writes about how citizens feel a disordered, and he calls it a zombie state, and are implicated in it and disempowered by it. He talks about a close relationship between elites and society and members of society who are caught in a kind of a sort of dysfunctional relationship of mutual disempowerment. They're trapped in the mess together. And I found plenty of this way of experiencing the state too. So I found both. I found both the kind of sort of seeing the state, and also this sort of more disempowering feeling the state. Now, I've offered quite a few binaries here. Outside, inside, seeing, feeling, control, dependence, order, disorder, objectivity, subjectivity. And of course, life is much messier than simple division into categories like this implies. But people do find creating binaries helpful. It helps them make sense of things, particularly difficult things. And that includes researchers. I'm not trying to say that these things are necessarily separated from each other in how people experience the state. But what I think I am saying is that the binary nature of the way in which people encounter buildings, or the potential binaries that are involved in it, do underline something important, which is an idea about an internal tension. Okay, so there's a sort of, it's not simple like it's all about seeing or it's all about feeling. Both of these things are involved, and they are necessarily in tension with each other, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And the reason why I've put this picture up is to try and explain how that works. This is Kwame Nkrumah was the first Prime Minister and then President of Ghana at independence, and he was a great independence hero and Pan-Africanist who was violently overthrown in a coup some years into his rule. And he was, when he was deposed, the statue of him in front of the parliament was pulled down and bashed about. You can see there's a hole in the back of his trouser leg, and he's lost an arm, and of course he was decapitated. And this is his mausoleum. So he died in exile in Guinea in disgrace, in sort of misery, and very lonely man. And then he was rehabilitated in Ghana. Now he's a real national hero, and they built this mausoleum, which is extremely grand. In fact, Daniel and I were there just a few months ago, and we went to look at this, and we were both very much impressed by. You go in and you see this very, very grand memorial, guarded by statues of musicians. And with, in fact, you can probably see it at the front, yes, the little gold statue at the front. It's not little, it's big, but it's in the distance. And it's sort of like it's Nkrumah in his glory. But if you go around the back, you see this statue, which is not about Nkrumah in his glory. It's about him being chucked out, being deposed and disgraced. And what they haven't done is put it back together. They've left it in its really battered, and we found this really interesting. It seems to me to be quite unusual to do this, to actually say this man, who we are revering in lots of ways, also was deposed, was thrown out, was disgraced. We did this. It was done to him. Here he is battered. He failed. It's a much, much more ambivalent picture of the man in this, I think, in this setup than you might expect. So what I'm trying to say about this is that there's something about being able to see both sides of these binaries, these various binaries of the state, and possibly to hold them together in your mind, in some cases more than in other cases. So more or less to be able to hold them in your mind. And I think more or less because it's more possible to hold order, chaos, seeing, feeling, and so on together in some places than in others. For me, the binary is a really useful way of trying to understand a complex and often internally inconsistent entity, the state, which often creates ambivalence of this kind, and other kinds, of course. So I want to say something really for the rest of the lecture about the 5 countries. And I want to sort of try and explore a little bit about how these binaries work, how much they come together, and how much they don't come together in the 5 countries that I'm looking at. And I'm going to do this brutally briefly. So in the book that I'm writing on this, each of the countries will have a full chapter, and I'm going to give you a tiny, tiny vignette and a sort of bit of a sense of where I think I'm going with each of them. So I start with South Africa. This is South Africa's parliament, which to my astonishment has Queen Victoria's statue in front of it. I couldn't find many South Africans who thought this was odd. I thought it was very odd. So the parliament is in a public park in the centre of Cape Town, and it's very easy for people to wander past it and have a good look at it. They can have a good look at the outside. Most people don't go inside. But they do see the insides because a lot of the proceedings are televised, and also they see or they feel the insides through rumours about what's going on. So people would describe the parliament to me as elegant, civilised, fancy, gracious, white, like a palace, a place to be admired and desired. And then, as one woman said in a focus group, and then they go chaos. So Parliament inside is thought of as unwelcoming, often as full of horror stories of torture chambers in the basement. A prime minister was actually murdered in the building during the apartheid era. But there's lots of there are real horror stories, and then there are sort of ideas about things that might go on inside, fighting, chaos, a place you don't want to enter, and a fear of what happens if you did go inside, what it might do to you and what you might do to it, it seems to me. So there was a kind of a fear of both of those things, that it might swallow you up somehow, but also that if people generally were let in, that they might just sort of pull it down or destroy it in some way. And in South Africa, one of something that came up in quite a few focus group discussions was the idea of the face brick. So this is a common thing that's used in South African architecture. It's a very stark metaphor of the separation between the outside. So the face brick has a face which is very beautiful, and then the inside, which is just ordinary, which is just a kind of ordinary block. It's not beautiful. It might be functional. It might actually even be pretty rubbish. It might be crumbly. It might not be very well made. So there's a sort of both a kind of rational beauty on the outside and then a more frightening or dysfunctional chaos in the inside. But in South Africa, I felt that these two were very much kept separate. There was a sort of anxiety about looking at them together. They were both quite powerful. People talked very volubly about both, but they didn't like to put them together. Okay, I said it was going to be brutally quick. So Ghana, this is the ministry's area in Accra, which is in the middle of Accra, sort of sleepy bit of the city where many of the government ministry buildings are found. And many of them are also were built during the interim period in the 1950s, when the British had agreed that they were going to go, but it was just before independence, so between about sort of the early 50s and 57 when independence happened. But they were quite a sort of mixed bunch of things, but they're very clearly visible and very clearly accessible. Really, it's easy just to walk in and wander around and even go inside and out again, and it's not really terribly difficult. And people talked about how they wander in and out of these buildings. They talk about how vendors can easily go inside to sell food and make their living. They describe them often as historic and scruffy. They're legible and they're a bit messy on the outside. In fact, I was quite sort of struck by how you can wander and see all the air conditioning units and the bins and everything, sort of like an sort of extruded state business, almost. And sometimes they talk about how they're actually a bit nicer inside than you might expect. They've got computers, they've got modern office furniture, but they're also, you know, inefficient or corrupt. And the insides, so the insides as well are quite sort of jumbled up and mixed thing. So I think that there's sort of, it isn't just this building, it's all the buildings in Ghana. There's a sort of sense in which the ones that the people talked about, that there's much more of an entwinement of the outsides and the insides, and of order and disorder, of all the dichotomies that I've outlined, that are all much more, yes, that and that together, or in and out, and objective and subjective, and ordered and disordered. There's even sometimes a kind of playfulness in people's ability to juxtapose the insides and the outsides, and the tidiness and the mess, and the objectivity and the subjectivity. Again, the attributes are there, the tensions are there, but in Ghana, it seems to be a bit easier to explore them together. Okay, so next door to Ghana is Côte d'Ivoire, which has a lot in common with Ghana in terms of its geography, its size, the size of its economy, different colonial histories, and different post-colonial histories. And it's strikingly different when you go to Abidjan or Yamoussoukro, which is the official capital of Côte d'Ivoire, in that it's full of extremely grand and impressive buildings built since independence. So there are lots of very grand architecture, and this one is the Basilica in Yamoussoukro, which is probably the grandest, the preeminent example of this grand architectural project, which was put together by the founding president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. This basilica is supposed to be the largest in the world. It's said to have doubled Côte d'Ivoire's national debt when it was made. The Pope came to inaugurate it. There are lots of rumours and funny stories about it. One of them is that the Pope, I don't know if this is true, the Pope said, "I won't come if you make it bigger than St. Peter's." And Houphouët-Boigny said, "Don't worry about it. We won't make it bigger than St. Peter's." And then after the Pope had gone, they stuck the cross at the top, and it took it over the line. People like that story. This is just one example. If you go to Abidjan, you find the most extraordinary skyscrapers in the central administrative centre of the city. And people describe them as jewels, as masterpieces, as works of genius, as un-African, and extraordinary. Extraordinary for an African country to achieve this. This was in the focus groups. They often appear even otherworldly. So Houphouët-Boigny was remarkable. He was not an ordinary man. He was not even perhaps a man. So people would say, we can't understand how all this could have been done. To me, it often seemed like a very strongly objective position. You're looking at these things and just thinking they've got nothing to do with me, nothing to do with here. They seem to be from somewhere else. But you do, and what happened in focus groups is after we'd had quite a lot of this kind of talk, and it was really, really common, everybody would sort of talk, would pile in with the eulogies about these extraordinary buildings. But after a while, you'd have a few sort of muttered comments and rumours about, and fantasies about rot and ruin. So people would start talking about malevolent ghosts that haunt the buildings, or bats, or lizards, or weeds. They would talk about the dead people who were buried in the foundations. And people would talk about these in ways that suggested that they were quite frightened by them, and it's quite difficult to talk about them. So it was very easy to talk about the rational, glamorous outsides, but the chaotic insides of buildings were really difficult. And in Côte d'Ivoire, people didn't really talk much about what happened inside buildings in terms of the business of government or the business of the state. They talked about these fantasies. And it was a bit like the chaotic insides were more like a disturbing secret. So the binary is sort of somehow between the two is much more unbalanced than it was in Ghana. The Democratic Republic of Congo. I think I have to pick up my speed. This is the High Court in Kinshasa. And when I first came to Kinshasa, I thought this looked like a very impressive structure. I think it is a very impressive building. It's one of Mobutu's big projects. But Quinoa, people who live in Kinshasa, described it almost like it was a mirage, and many of the buildings, like they were part of a mirage. And for them, it seemed to represent the idea of what law should mean, but it had no connection with what actually happens inside. So it was like, yes, 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 but the only thing that tells us is that this isn't what's happening. It's just this extraordinary juxtaposition of what it should be, but it isn't. And what people really wanted to talk about was how the insides of these state buildings were a mess, things didn't work, they were falling to bits, there was no equipment, in fact, they weren't even functioning at all as government buildings. This one was. I went in and saw some cases being heard. But many of the ministry buildings, people say, well, nothing happens in them because the ministers moved their families and friends in. They're living in the buildings. So as much as there was an objective ideal of the state, which I think there was, it lived in citizens' imaginations. So they had an idea of what they thought this building should be doing. Or the other one that was a really good example was the state media building, which, you know, they said, well, this building says it's about free speech, but that's just nonsense. So actually dealing with the state, going into it, was something of a subjective nightmare. And now I'm going to move on to my final one, which is Ethiopia. This is part of Emperor Menelik's palace in Addis Ababa, which was recently opened up to the public in Unity Park, which was a part which was a palace and bits of the state which were highly secretive for many years, and where the state lived. And they've recently been made into a kind of museum. And this is part of it. And you can walk around, you can have a look at where Menelik was, and you can have a look at where Haile Selassie worked, or you can have a look at when the Derg, the Marxist regime that overthrew Haile Selassie, where they sat and how they used these buildings to look at the citizens. And you can sort of have a real sense of Ethiopia's history, or this history of the state, by going in and looking at this building. And it's part of a common thing in Ethiopia where you have a series of buildings going right back to 2,000 years of buildings which had housed the state, which had been palaces of emperors and kings, which have been now decommissioned and made into museums. Now, the thing that I found with the Ethiopian focus groups was that people really didn't talk about state buildings at all. They just didn't want to talk about them. There was a sort of just absence. There seemed to be a kind of absence of description of active state buildings. So I thought, well, okay, there's a recent history in Ethiopia of buildings protected by tanks. They're still protected by soldiers with guns on their laps. You walk past them, you don't walk past them because it's actually a bit scary. But people don't even seem to look at them, never mind go inside or think about what's going on inside. And they were much more comfortable in describing these decommissioned buildings. And there was lots of description of Unity Park when I did my research. Quite objective descriptions of the history of the country, the history of the state. They're very sanitized because they're empty. And they've been whitewashed and they've been beautifully restored. This is particular. I mean, they all are actually. They're all extremely wonderful to go into. They're amazing buildings, but they're empty. My colleague Brooke Haile Selassie, who was here last week, talks about them as having been Disneyfied. It's like you turn the state into a sort of theme park, and in fact, this place has also got a zoo and. Sort of, it's a good day out. You can have an ice cream. It's like an echo of the real thing, a merely material echo of the real thing, while the real state has moved on and it's out of reach. And I think perhaps draws power from being out of reach and out of sight, and perhaps even out of imagination. And it's a very, very difficult thing to get people to talk about it, and talk about the buildings, even talk about what they might imagine goes on inside them. Okay, I'm going to conclude. This is my last slide, and it's a picture, a piece of art by Joanna Chumali, and it's of Abidjan, the towers that I showed you near the beginning, and I like it very much. I want to sort of make this argument that I think buildings are good analogies of the state because they illustrate a tension between these binaries, between order and disorder and so on. And Roberto Venturi, who's an architectural historian, argues that it's the tension between order and chaos that makes a building compelling. If you have a perfectly regular building, it's really quite boring. And if you have a very chaotic, put together building, then it's a bit of a mess. And architecture, he says, works when it produces a tension between the two. So you don't just see perfect regularity. You see some regularity and you see bits of unexpected, perhaps things that even jar you a bit. And I think this idea speaks to Jens Bartelson's work on the critique of the state. Bartelson argues that the state draws critical interest, so we're endlessly fascinated by the state because of its essential ambiguity. It's impossible to work out quite what it is, and that's what makes it endlessly fascinating. And I think that this ambiguity rests on the fact that the state is rarely straightforwardly rational or merely chaotic. It's both together. It embodies and describes a relationship between order and chaos. But that happens very differently in different states who are read by their own societies in different ways. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Julia. I have been involved, I was a part of the project for 3 years, but I've always found it's captivating whenever Julia talks about the mundane ways in which people use architecture to talk about politics and let's say in Africa. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. Any questions?
Very much, that was fascinating. I haven't seen the exhibition yet, so I'm looking forward to having a look at it afterwards. And I'm looking forward to reading the book to get all the detail about what people did identify as their key representative buildings. The one that has struck me in retrospect in Ghana was the fact that the state kept the president's residence and office in an old slave castle for decades after independence. And this made me think two things. One, that people are their rationale for that, and they did think about it, was we are occupying it.
Yes.
It is now ours, and therefore it is valid to use this, not to reject it, but to occupy it and take it over. When they then built an enormous sort of imitation stool, President's office, the Presidents were very reluctant to move in there. And I don't know where they are now, but both of them were fairly dysfunctional buildings. My point is, people are often much more comfortable with historical ambiguity in buildings, like Queen Victoria outside the Parliament building, than we academics might think. And they absorb that. You see it in this country. But I particularly liked the ambiguity of the High Court in Kinshasa as well. It represents something that we know doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean we don't recognise it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it is. So the Ghanaian, so Nkrumah, when he became Prime Minister in 1957, decided he was going to move into this building, which had been a slave fort on the west coast of Africa, built in the 1600s and occupied by various European powers. And it was where slaves were taken and they were then shipped off to the Americas. And then it became the colonial governor's headquarters during the British rule. And then Nkrumah decided he was going to move into it. And everybody said, well, you can't do that. Well, not everybody, but a lot of Westerners said, well, you can't do that. And he said, actually, I need to, because I'm going to occupy this ground. I'm going to make it Ghanaian. It's going to become ours. And exactly. And so he actually, and he did that. So he was sort of both overturning the history, but also he was borrowing its authority to an extent, because that building's pretty intimidating. And it sort of sits there in this, and it has this terrifying history, and people talk about it. So they talked about that a lot, and they talked about how, they found the history scary, and they knew what had happened inside, and they found it chilling and stressful, but also that there was something about the layers of history that had come on top since that made it belong to them, and it was part of them. And I think that's true in other parts of the continent. So South Africa have done it very deliberately with the Constitutional Court, where they've taken an old apartheid-era prison and made it into the Constitutional Court and used the bricks and materials from the building. And that's very much about saying, actually we don't sort of pretend that we can start again, but we do it in our own terms. Well, that's the ideal. The Jubilee House is another story. They are there now, though. They're living in it. They're using it. Yeah.
You mentioned that you weren't allowed to take pictures inside state buildings, and I was just wondering if you could just speak on that a little bit more. I understand, of course, they don't want you to see offices or private businesses and things like that. If you came across the rationale or the logic for not wanting to take pictures for research purposes, if you told them what you were doing there and things like that. Security.
Yeah. Actually, didn't you nearly get arrested taking photographs in Whitehall?
Yeah, I was about to.
Yeah. So I don't think it's just an African thing. But yes, so some buildings, in fact, the Union buildings that I showed at the beginning in South Africa, they're a great tourist attraction, and that's fine. They love, taking photographs is fine. You don't go inside, though. Nobody. I didn't meet anybody that had been inside. I mean, nobody had been inside. Nobody even seemed to know anybody who'd been inside. I tried to get inside. I didn't manage it. I bet Nick's been in. But a lot of buildings are very secretive inside, and a lot of buildings are also very unphotographable on the outside. So. Actually, the Jubilee House is a good example in Ghana. Ghanaians are usually quite relaxed about things, but if you even walk on the side of the road next to it, the guards shout at you. So there was absolutely no way I was going to take my camera out. I did take a sneaky one from a taxi. I think it was always about security. You always feel, though, with the security argument, I think, there's something that you might spoil about the kind of mystery and authority that gives the state. I'm sure that's part of it, that you don't actually want to expose it too fully. You want to keep it a bit mysterious. So I think that's probably a large part of it.
Phil, and there was a second.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Yeah, fascinating presentation. It's been great to see how you put it all together over all of these years. Two questions. One is, so this seems a very urban project. Is there a rural component at all? Do you have any sense of what your rural respondents think of these buildings? Do any of these buildings resonate in the rural imagination? Does that come into the project at all? And then I guess the second question is about, one thing that strikes me about the 5 places, and particularly the 5 cities that you've picked, is that they're going to be the mega cities of the future. They're growing exponentially. Places where there's a huge amount of construction, there's a huge amount of urban change. Is part of the story here also people latching onto buildings that seem to have some permanence? What strikes me about many of the buildings that your respondents seem to have guided you to is that they are often buildings of the immediate post-colonial period. They seem to represent history, independence, permanence to a certain extent, in context where these cities are changing out of sight. And I imagine people often feel like they're losing a grip, they're losing control because of the pace of that change. So I just wonder, where these particular buildings fit into that big picture of the massive changes in African cities.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. So on the urban-rural thing, this was an urban project. I mean, doing 5 countries was already a bit of a stretch, a bit foolish, in fact. And I decided that what I would do is I would concentrate on the urban, on the capital cities, basically, or not entirely. I mean, in South Africa they have more than one, so they sort of you get to cover more. But the reasoning being that this is where the state is at its height. This is where you have the most encounters with the state. The state is at its strongest, and so you have citizens who feel it and experience it and see it much more closely. If I'd done it in rural areas, I think that would have possibly produced a very different story, and it would have been another interesting story. Can I recommend Daniel's book on the state in Ethiopia, which is very much about rural perspectives and what it looks like from far away, and it's very different. As you know, Phil, the Mamdani's spidery beast is the way that states during the colonial period were very much concentrated on capital cities because mostly they couldn't afford to put it out around the rural areas, and so it sort of has much more a sort of immediacy and power in. But that's why I did it. But it would be fascinating to look at it from rural perspectives. The megacities of the future. Yeah, it's funny. Somebody asked me recently about whether people talked about the future when they were thinking about this, and actually, on the whole, they didn't. I think people were very much more interested in the past and where they came from, and very sort of anxious about losing the past. And so I suppose in as much as people were, so particularly in Addis Ababa, which changes by the hour, with bits of the historical bits of the city just disappearing to these massive, great big new structures, which people don't feel very familiar with. I think there is across certainly some of the countries. So I think probably in Ghana was very strong, and in Ethiopia, a sense of we mustn't lose these things. They are part of who we are and where we come from, and if we lose them, we're going to lose who we are. And I guess that some of that must be related to that sort of anxiety about what the city is changing into and what it doesn't look recognisable. And of course, when I did meetings with older people, they were full of nostalgia and stories for the old stuff that's gone and what that loss meant. So I think that's probably true. I mean, in South Africa it was a bit different because I think there were more. Well, so it was obviously complicated, but there were many people who were very attached to the old buildings, even the Union buildings, the Queen Victoria stuff, and the Parliament and so on. Very much, this is part of who we are. This is, we can't get rid of it, and almost a sort of anxiety of what happens if you do, because there were quite a few younger people, particularly, who would be, would say, well, we should just flatten a lot of them. Let's start again. Why do we want these buildings made by white colonialists? It's not us. And that actually produces a tension, I think an intergenerational tension about, but then what? Then chaos? Then what? And I think that's part of the reason why this kind of the inside-outside thing in South Africa is so tense, actually. Thanks.
Looks like there and here.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a very fascinating presentation, and I've been most eye-opener for me. And sitting now, as you said, that for me, now we're talking of the state, post-colonial states. So I think, to be fair for the Africans, you should have really looked pre, because there were states there. And for that, you would have been able to see the indigenous architecture, which have really contributed how the states have really could be portrayed in those buildings. Well, they have the palaces of the old, the kings and the queens, and also the chiefs and the whatnot. So it, well, of course it is a research, so also all your research is also looking at this, on this side of it, therefore it is fine. And for me, well, I think when I saw the pictures, I saw that this is indication how the Western architecture has really influenced or changed the architecture of Africa.
I absolutely agree with you.
And,
yeah.
And I really don't know, I haven't read the book, but I think you have, for your presentation, you have used different buildings, so you might have your own reason. And when I saw the Lion ministers in Ghana, in Accra, and when I see them now here sitting, I said, oh, okay, does it really represent the people? Or does it really represent the states, the inlets? Because when I see all the air conditioner, the air conditioner installed, most of the citizens doesn't know what an air conditioner is. So you can really see the gap between the people and the elite or the civil servants in one way. And for Ethiopia, I think, I'm an Ethiopian, so, well, I think as you have taken the cathedral in Côte d'Ivoire, well, if you have gone to the churches, then you would be able to see how the state, well, of course, during the emperor time, well, there was the state and the government were the same. So I think it would have really been possible to see more of it of that. And then the Menelik building that you have shown there, I think, yes, and of course the way you explained it, well, there are labs, of course there are armies, of course, protecting like any palace. So it is not a unique thing for Ethiopia alone.
No, that's true.
So I think if you go to, there are different line ministries in Ethiopia which are, well, accessible to the people. So like the one in Accra. Thank you, sorry.
No, can I just say that I didn't choose the buildings, that these all came up in focus groups. So I said the opening question was, what's the most important public building? And these were what people chose. We were talking about the state. That's what people realized. That's what we were talking about. So nobody, I mean, obviously in Ethiopia it's different because you have, you weren't colonized. That's part of it. But also you have this architectural history, which...
We have never been colonized. We have been under the...
I know. You weren't colonized. But certainly some of those buildings were talked about. But they were usually more like museums or buildings that you could visit, like the castles at Gondar or at Aksum and so on. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Merely out of curiosity, I wonder if you could say a thing about how you chose your cities. I do see rational regional representation, West, Central, and so forth. But I suppose the question will be, how did you choose Ghana over Nigeria?
It's my bitter regret. It was so hard. It was really hard to choose. And I've been to Nigeria. I've done work in Nigeria, and I've never been to Ghana. So that's one reason. That is one reason. That was one reason, I have to confess. The other point was I wanted to look at a Francophone West African country, and my feeling about if I chose Côte d'Ivoire was that one of the interesting things about Côte d'Ivoire was the attempt to move the capital. So to start again, to build a new capital in Yamoussoukro. And of course, that's what happened in Nigeria too with Abuja. More successfully, actually, than in Côte d'Ivoire. And so I felt that was a story that I wanted to look at, but I was already looking at it in Côte d'Ivoire. So that was another reason really for choosing Ghana. But I could have chosen so many other countries and done a fantastic project. It was a very painful choice. In fact, I have to confess, originally I was going to do 7. And I actually got funding to do 7. And actually this was one good thing that came out of COVID was that I had an excuse not to do 7 because it was far too much. 5 is quite a lot as it is. So yeah, I would have liked to do all of them really. Nigeria next time.
Thank you for your talk. You chose 2 categories of buildings. There are the repurposed ones and the brand new built from scratch. And I wondered whether, I got the impression that the repurposed ones were relogged, as it were, that people didn't identify with the new, the new function, but they were, it was a reappropriation. Whereas the new ones appear to leave people either indifferent or even quite hostile to them.
Yeah,
yeah. It so happens that in the new ones that you chose, the architecture, as the gentleman was saying earlier, is not particularly African or anything. It's
So I think a lot of the architecture, particularly in the early days of independence, was very self-consciously not trying to look African. That there was a sort of feeling about the importance of modernization. The 1960s, you're talking about, of making a state that looks like a state. And to look like a state, you don't go back to vernacular forms. And so in a way, they were sort of producing a modernist version that was in some ways similar to the colonial version, in that it was also about, essentially, in a way, a kind of civilizing attempt, a kind of modernization. I mean, that wasn't entirely true. I mean, there were people there was Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, who was more interested in thinking about trying to find a more African aesthetic. And even Mobutu in Zaire, as Congo was called then, was interested in, although he built, as you saw with the court, a very modernist structure, he also liked to have depictions of traditional craft making or activities as murals on the buildings to kind of juxtapose the two and say, this is African, this is part of what we are. But I think in more recent years, there's actually been quite a shift in this. And in fact, my colleague, IB, who I think came in late, but he's been looking at parliament buildings that have been built much more recently. And a lot of them, they do attempt to look at actually pre-colonial forms. Like in Zimbabwe, the parliament incorporates the Great Zimbabwe Cone as part of its structure. Nick mentioned the Jubilee Palace in Ghana, and it's modelled on an Akan stool, which is sort of this shape. I wish I had a picture of it, actually. It has it's curved inwards, and it has a flat top to look like a stool, which is in Akan tradition a part of sort of political authority, or a symbol of political authority. And so there have been sort of attempts to try and create new kinds of vernacular aesthetics. They sometimes sort of hark back to old architectural aesthetics, and sometimes they borrow different kinds of forms. But there are shifts towards that, and some of them people like, and some of them they don't like. But there is also an attachment, I think, often to some of the old buildings, even if they seem to be really quite alien and weird.
There, right then, here. I need this.
I'm going to be greedy. I have 2 questions. So the initial question of what public building is important, I guess, depending on who you're speaking to, would have affected what they would have said, as you already kind of outlined. In cases where, I guess, people weren't sure, did proximity play a part? So if they are close to a public building, numbers of state buildings within the country? Did that also have an impact from, I guess, again, recall of participants? And was it always obvious from what participants said that they were talking about a state building as opposed to a building that might represent the state? So it might not be kind of, like you said, a public building, but it's really important that participants feel has some sort of meaning either now or in the past, as we talked about, I guess, less of the future, as you mentioned that many didn't talk about that.
So proximity, I think that's true, and it was true in some places, particularly in South Africa, where I didn't get many people. Well, so not many people talked about the union buildings in Cape Town, where I did some work. Most people talked about the Parliament. So obviously, it makes a difference if you live with a building, and this is something about being up close to the state, I think. So, and a lot of people, and I haven't really talked about it, but a lot of people did talk about buildings that they use every day, sort of like hospital or school or police station, and so they would talk about their local one and their own experiences of it. So that certainly was part of it, and those were sort of more about the kind of the frustration with. I think it sort of speaks to that idea about that gap between where the grand people live and the kinds of facilities that we have to put up with, which don't come off well most of the time. I didn't get the point about numbers.
I guess, obviously, when I think about state buildings, I'm thinking of really grandiose things like Houses of Parliament or kind of Ministry of Defence and things like that. I wouldn't necessarily think about, like you said, hospitals or police stations. So I guess, did participants make that connection between those kind of really big government ones and more of those kind of day-to-day ones?
Yeah, absolutely they did. And in some groups, the conversation was dominated by, and I mean, often like in Ghana, in Accra, there's a big hospital, Kolebu Hospital, which everybody talked about, and it's a kind of flagship hospital. The same in Soweto in Johannesburg. There's a big the big Soweto Hospital, the name of which I cannot pronounce. Thank you. So yes, and in a way, those were interesting because they were big symbols of the state and what the state provided. But they were also things that people often had direct experience of and could talk about using them. So yes, they did come up quite a lot. Yes, I think people they got the state thing. There wasn't really much. So occasionally somebody might talk about housing. We had a few conversations about housing. We had a really interesting discussion about the Accra craft market. Actually, I found that fascinating. I'm going to definitely put that in my book. And it was a sort of state-sponsored building, so in a way it does work. But actually, no, on the whole, people got the point and realised that we were talking about the state, and that was what the discussion was about.
Hi.
Hello.
I was just very interested in your approach. I'm an architect, and most of my teaching is history, theory, interpretation of architecture. Your approach is really fascinating, but it doesn't follow, if you like, traditional processes like typological studies or the building as a symbol, and you reference like quite well-known theoreticians like Alasma or Venturi. And this question, you didn't say just until recently, I came in a bit late, but you were talking about how buildings felt, and then objective and subjective positions with regard to interpretation. And you didn't until a minute ago, as far as I can remember, talk about the building directly as a symbol, but there's this implication that part of what you're trying to address is the kind of spirit of the kind of sometimes concealed spirit, also caught up in rumours and so on. So I just wanted to just come back and dig a little deeper or ask you a bit more about how the process of interpretation draws upon a kind of method that you've been developing, where that fits in with regard to a contribution that is sort of significant and now and timely, especially in this image. I'm reminded when I look at this image of a lecture I went to by the late, great Vanessa Watson, in fact very near here, where she was talking about African urban fantasies and talking about the skyline and how it often doesn't fit, and yet that the missing link was applying her kind of interpretation of cities at the scale of architecture, which seems in a way partly to be what you're doing. You're bringing a different way of thinking about architecture to this topic. So I'm trying to answer the question for you, which I should leave to you.
Maybe why not? Okay, I'm not an architect. I came at this as an ignorant pleb. Actually, I did, and I got interested because I thought it seemed to me that people did talk about buildings, and that when they talked about, and in Africa you find so many, you find a lot of colonial buildings, which I thought was interesting, and people talked about them, and then you find these new buildings, and one of the things I think has come up quite a lot in the discussion is about this importation of styles and methods from outside the continent, which have really shaped the way the state looks through its buildings, and continue to, actually, because although you don't get so many Westerners coming along and building buildings, a lot of the new big grand state architecture is built by the Chinese or by Indian firms and funded by the Indian government. So actually that still goes on. So the state, in a way, one of the things that really interested me was this way in which that sort of spoke to everything that we think about when we look at African politics, which is this idea of the state as being something which doesn't quite fit and is a bit uncomfortable, and how does that work? And then I just thought, well, that just makes so much sense then, to look at the aesthetics. And then, because I wasn't an architect, I started reading some of the history and the theory, and I was quite delighted to find that most people aren't really interested in what ordinary people think about buildings in this literature. They're interested in what the architects have in mind or what the people commissioning it. And I thought, this is what I'm interested in, is what citizens think, because I want to think about how states build authority, and how in post-colonial, which most of my cases are, in post-colonial context, how the state begins to draw people into thinking this matters, and it's part of me, and how I are going to sort of feel that it represents me, or it symbolises something that is meaningful to me, and how difficult that project is in many parts of the continent. And so how do you do that with buildings? And that's where I sort of came in, and so getting people to describe the buildings. I think this is the point. Maybe you missed this bit. It was something about the kind of emotional or physical encounters with the buildings that then allowed me to sort of think about what that meant. So as a non-architect, I can't describe the buildings in the terms that you would be able to, and I don't even try. I'm much more interested in the kind of personification of buildings, or the kind of way in which people project, ideas of bits of bodies, or often sort of find forms in them which look more human, or look like a monster, or look like something, or look like a hat, or like something else, or a stool. And that seemed to me to be actually for what I wanted to know, which was why they made sense to people, how they made sense out of the buildings, and how that then came to give them a sort of sense of affinity with them. And that's, for me, is about the authority of the state and what that means. So that's how I've done it. And it's not very architectural. It's sort of, but I quite like it. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Sarah, and I can think one more to Daria. One more, and Manjit.
Julia, thank you so much for this afternoon talk, and it's just so wonderful to see it all coming together. I guess one of the things that I'm reminded of how much I love this aspect of your project, which, the way in which the sensorium works around these buildings is fascinating, and especially this point that you make about how when you suspend kind of the dominance of seeing and the visible, right, and people talk about the insides of buildings that they have not been inside, the way the sensorium shows up is just fascinating. I've always always...
And you've done that too.
Yes, but except like a little bit less so with spaces that are truly unseen at all. I think that's really interesting. So thank you for that. I have two questions. One of them has already been started to kind of, you've started a conversation about it. But I was struck by how, I mean, and this possibly has something to do with the way you wanted to photograph some of these buildings, but how there's very little presence of people in the images that we saw today. And I guess a little bit, I started to ask myself, you know, when people were identifying state buildings, you know, and especially if you're saying a lot of them have not been inside many of the buildings that were chosen, why is it that buildings that are very heavily visited by people, like for example, if I were to sit in a focus group in Cairo, the first thing I would say was in Mugama, which is this building where we all go day in and day, you know, to do bureaucracy and get birth certificates and so on and so forth, and just a really like visceral experience of the state, a very frustrating one, but very important one. Like you're born in Mugama, really, you become an Egyptian there. That's a little bit.
And maybe die there too.
But and I was thinking about like, you know, and then, but you sort of, there's an interesting juxtaposition here of like these big buildings that people don't go inside and are very like, you know, I don't know, presidential palaces or parliaments or whatever. And then the local hospital and the police. And I wondered about the spaces in the middle, which is where you really encounter the state kind of in a very everyday sense, or the courts or bureaucracies and so on, and where they figured and how people described or defined what a state building is. And I imagine images of those would have to include lots of people. So that was one. And the second one, I just wanted to give you space. Tell us a little bit more about the comparative, where it was going in terms of how we theorize the state. Because it's so interesting to think about, you know, if people were talking about these buildings in the DRC as producing a mirage of what the state is but is not, I mean, that seems to me like something you could possibly say about so many states. But why was it so evident in the DRC and not in other places that you were studying? So I guess I wanted to push a little bit, give you that space to tell us a little bit more about, okay, what's that comparative doing for you in terms of theorizing the state?
Okay, all right. I think I feel a bit shy about taking photographs of people. At one point, I had this excuse that I said to myself, which is I'm becoming like an architect and I don't want all the mess of the people in the way. But actually, I've met lots of architects that say, no, you must have people in the pictures. So I don't think that's true. I think I just felt shy about it. And it's also quite difficult being a white researcher taking photographs of state buildings. And I think probably I probably just consciously avoided it, actually, yeah. Bureaucratic buildings. It's really funny, there is a bit of a gap there. I'm trying to think of when people talked about that, because I think you're right about, I mean, I bet you if I'd gone to Cairo, the people would have talked about that a lot. So there was a bit of it. I mean, there was a lot of visiting police stations, but that was much more about, again, there was a bit of it in South Africa. There's stuff about where you go to pay your bills, or stuff where you go to sort of, you get your driving license, or the kind of the state material, the sort of the documents that you need to be a citizen, and that can be very arduous to collect. But interestingly, it wasn't something that people lingered on. It was I don't know why. It was much. In as much as they did, it was a kind of, as you say, an arduous, sort of draining, boring, uncomfortable process. And actually, maybe in my study, for some reason, they seem to sort of be more interested in either the kind of the veneer and the sort of ideal, and then the really horrible stuff like, you know, the smell of a police station and how disgusting it was, or of a hospital. Well, somebody said something nice about a hospital. They said it smelled of medicine, so it doesn't. I assume that's nice. Maybe it's not. On the comparative thing about theorising the state, okay, I think this is difficult and something that I'm still working on. so I think, yes, I do think, I think what there is always a bit of both these things going on, both sort of feeling objective and feeling subjective in relation to the state. I think they're both there, and I think I'm trying to get that out of the field work and what people said and how they felt, and that they have these two different approaches. And I think that's true, that would seem to be true to varying extents everywhere, and I think it might be, true not just in Africa. It's something, we all have this sense of the sort of, because I think there's something about the state that's something that, it's a bit like authority itself. It has an element of the kind of the underlying potential for violence that we know the state always has, and also the sense of something that it could promise or that we would like it to do, and the sense of how it contains and orders things and makes some sort of sense of safety. And they're both there, and that's what makes, I think that's what I'm arguing makes the state compelling, because they're both there, they're both part of authority, and you can't have one without, it's sort of like if you just thought it was a perfect benign, it would be a bit boring. And if you just thought it was horrible, you really wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. So I think what I'm trying to get at is that they kind of, they're in tension with each other, but that in some places, like Congo, the veneer is so thin. It's not that it sort of floats away. It's sort of almost you're trying to hang on to the memory of it or the idea of it, and the sort of the really horrible side of it's much more in your face and what you live with. Whereas and it's different in the different countries, but in Côte d'Ivoire, what struck me was the way in which people hung on to the beauty and the ideal, and almost like didn't want to see the nasty sort of horrible bits. And then you wonder, how, I don't know why it is that, I think there are historical reasons and cultural reasons, and why it is that in some places people can bear to look at the horror. Is it because the state is a bit more robust, or is it because in Congo there's nothing, you can't deny it, it's just there. Whereas in Côte d'Ivoire there's something about the fragility of a state which has been under an enormous amount of strain and pressure for quite a number of years, and does look quite fragile, and therefore you kind of invest in believing or pretending to believe in this image of the sort of the perfection of it, and you sort of don't look too closely at the horrible stuff. Or in South Africa, where I think you have a real sense in which you have both very strongly, but you just don't put them together. So I think that's where I'm going with it. So I kind of want this sort of, that they're there in tension everywhere, and that's what makes the state compelling and important everywhere, but they manifest very differently. Yeah. We need a drink.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Julia. You mentioned in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, mysticism, or how people talk about the secrets inside these buildings. You also talked about the dead, and I think the supernatural power of February. So I'm wondering if you've encountered any narrative of witchcraft when people talk about these buildings. I'm asking the question because when you look at Saoura and Brazzaville, in Brazzaville, for example, people think of how the elites are trying to use witchcraft to maintain power and to control the population. So,
yes,
that's my question.
Yeah.
And thank you, Julia, for listening to talk. I follow up on that, and also on Sarah's. I was going to ask you about religious spaces, whether anyone mentioned that in the groups, or religious sites.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So witchcraft does. It came up. It came up quite a bit in South Africa, and it came up quite a bit in Côte d'Ivoire, and it came up in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, quite a bit. And people talked about. But people like to talk about the Chinese are quite witchy when they put up their buildings overnight, but also things like people often things that go on at night or under the bottom of the building, or in the dark or behind closed doors, and that these things actually make the state seem very much more powerful. And I think it might be linked to religion, particularly in Ethiopia, where, again, and this is not about witchcraft, this is about Christianity, this is about the importance of the kind of underlying importance of spirituality in holding the state up. And I actually like to think about it, I haven't talked about this, but I think that the remarkable churches in Lalibela, which are buried under the ground, they are the most extraordinary things, and yet you can't see them. They're not at all about projecting spectacle in an open sort of way, but much more about the kind of the hidden nature of real power and the ways in which some state elites make use of that. I mean, certainly it's very powerful in Ethiopia, but also in Côte d'Ivoire, where you have the basilica that I showed you is very much, again, an attempt by a president to sort of bolster his sort of a certain amount of his authority by using the church. So, yeah, I think one of the things that I think is going to be part of the book is thinking about the importance of what's hidden. And sometimes that's people feel it and talk about it as something that they feel, but it's certainly not usually manifest in the sort of external aspects of the state. Okay.
Thank you very much. So, may I say next week we have our fifth speaker, Laura Rousey from Newcastle University. Her talk is Architecture of Colonial Imprisonment, the Afterlives of Colonial Incarceration in Africa. Next week, Thursday?
Yes, at 5.
And we have drinks downstairs. So
in the gallery.
In the gallery, yeah.
Please do join us. Thank you.